Welcome to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia, the story of the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles and the victim who never dreamed of infamy. This is H. Allegra Lansing. In Dreaming Beyond Medford, we meet a fragile young girl from Massachusetts, a survivor of illness and absence, already learning that dreaming might be her only escape. 79 years ago, a body was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. The discovery was so brutal, so incomprehensible, that the name of the victim was almost immediately erased and replaced with something darker, more cinematic, more permanent. She was no longer Elizabeth Short, the 22-year-old young woman from Massachusetts. She was something else. The Black Dahlia. That nickname, so elegant yet so foreboding, has survived longer than anyone alive who truly knew her. It has outlasted her sisters, her mother, her friends, and surely her killer. That name insists upon an identity louder than the voices of the people who could have told us who Elizabeth really was. And it has consumed her memory. The crime is unforgettable. A young woman's body cut in two, drained of blood, surgically arranged as if she were an exhibit in a grotesque museum. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a housewife walking with her little girl saw what she thought was a mannequin discarded in the weeds of a still undeveloped street. When she realized it was human, the scream carried into history. From that moment, Elizabeth Short, the victim, ceased to exist as a person. She became a headline. She became a warning. She became a commodity. She became a myth. But myths lie. They twist. They seduce. The newspapers, hungry for scandal, printed that she was a prostitute, that she was a failed actress, that she was a liar who deserved her fate. Later generations of writers, filmmakers, and even fine artists turned her into a canvas for their own obsessions. James Ellroy wrote her as a dark muse for L.A. Noire. Brian De Palma staged her as spectacle. Ryan Murphy and others revived her for television, a caricature of who Elizabeth Short had actually been. The Black Dahlia became, as Joan Didion once suggested in her way, less a woman than a mirror for the city of angels itself. But here is the truth. Elizabeth Short was none of those things. She was not a prostitute. She was not a movie starlet. She was not a cipher without a story. She was not the sexual adventuress that police tried to sell to a public terrified of post-war crime. She was a girl, barely a woman, one of 5 sisters, the daughter of a mother who worked herself to the bone, the abandoned child of a father who faked his own death. She was fragile, but she was also determined. She was ill, but she craved beauty and freedom. She was restless, but she was also deeply lonely. And this is where our story begins. Not in that field in Leimert Park, not in the morgue, not in the scandal sheets. Our story begins in New England with a little girl who could not have known that her face would one day be carved into history. If you are listening to this podcast, chances are you already know the outline of the Black Dahlia case. You know the headlines? Maybe you've stared at those infamous photographs, the ones leaked by police, reproduced endlessly online. Maybe you've argued with friends about suspects. Was it the sinister doctor, the shady nightclub owner, or maybe the slippery mortuary worker? We will get to all of that. The suspects, the investigation, the theories, they will each have their place. But before we pick apart the suspects, we have to rip apart the myth, because the myth has suffocated Elizabeth Short as effectively as her killer did. Why does this case fascinate us? Because it is unsolved, yes. Because it is grotesque, yes. But also because it is about a young woman whose life was so ordinary, so fragile, so much like yours or mine, that her transformation into legend feels like a theft. The Black Dahlia is the patron saint of unsolved crime. She is the archetype of the murdered woman as spectacle. But Elizabeth Short is still, after all these years, voiceless. Unless we give her voice back. That is what this podcast is about. I am not promising you a solution to the mystery. I will not tell you who really killed the Black Dahlia. I don't think we will ever know. But what I can tell you is Elizabeth Short's life, in all its complications, in all its sadness, in all its yearning. And if we follow the story of her life closely enough, if we honor it carefully enough, maybe we will begin to understand why she was vulnerable, why she was targeted, and why her story has never let us go. Over this first episode, we will walk through Elizabeth Short's childhood, her family, her parents, her sisters, her health, and her early dreams. This may not be the part of the story that usually captures headlines, but I believe the clues to who Elizabeth became are here. Her longing for love, her fragile health, her resilience in the face of abandonment, her hunger for escape. They were written in childhood, and they explain everything about the woman she became. Because if we are ever going to understand Elizabeth Short, if we are ever going to rescue her from the myth of the Black Dahlia, we must begin with the girl from Medford. To understand Elizabeth Short, we must begin with her parents, Cleo and Phoebe, because their story, long before Elizabeth's, is a story about promise and collapse, about the American dream slipping through fingers, about a family built on hope and undone by betrayal. Her father was born Alvin Cleo Short in Maine in 1896, the son of English and Irish stock. Cleo, as he was known, grew up in Portland, later drifting south in search of opportunity. Like many young men in the early 20th century, he was ambitious but not wealthy, industrious but not particularly stable. Phoebe May Sawyer was different. She was also born in Portland, Maine in 1902, the daughter of respectable, hard-working parents. Where Cleo was restless, Phoebe was grounded. Where he chased ventures, she sought security. They met, courted, and married in the early 1920s. Their first daughter, Virginia May, was born in Portland in 1920. Their second daughter, Dorothea, was born in 22. By 1924, they were living in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston. It was here that Elizabeth was born on July 29, 1924, their third daughter. No middle name, just one of many false narratives spun around the child that became Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth was followed by Eleanora in 1925, and finally Muriel Arlene in 1928. The marriage between Cleo and Phoebe was typical of the era, patriarchal in structure, but not without tenderness. Cleo took on the role of provider, working initially as a machinist. Phoebe, like so many women of her generation, managed the home and cared for the children. Phoebe is remembered as a devoted mother, strong, pragmatic, and resourceful. She kept her daughters clothed and fed, even when resources were scarce. She was not glamorous, but she embodied a quiet dignity that her children never forgot. Then Cleo found work in a new field, as salesman for a company constructing miniature golf courses, a craze sweeping America during the Roaring '20s. He wasn't an architect drawing blueprints at a drafting table. He was on the ground, meeting property owners, signing contracts. In the 1920s, that was respectable middle-class work and an upgrade economically for the Short family. Then in October 1929, the crash came. The stock market collapse didn't just wipe out investors, it rippled outward, devastating industries tied to disposable income. Miniature golf was a novelty, a luxury for the middle class. Almost overnight, Cleo's business disappeared. By 1930, the Short family had lost their income and their stability. Cleo grew despondent, his prospects limited. Phoebe carried the household burden, stretching every dollar. Then, one morning, Cleo's car was discovered abandoned near the Charlestown Bridge. Police assumed the worst, that he had taken his own life. It was the Depression, and suicides by desperate men were sadly common. Phoebe spent days visiting hospitals, frantic to find her husband. By the time police informed her that Cleo had likely taken his own life, she also discovered $500 missing from their accounts. She was now considered a widow with 5 daughters to raise alone. Her resilient nature told her to keep her chin up, her countenance calm, and her family together. The secret fears she had about her reality must be unvoiced. But when I think about Cleo Short leaving his car stranded on the bridge that day with $500 in his pocket, I feel like vomiting. Not just because he was a scoundrel and because he left his family in the lurch, but because his middle daughter inherited his restlessness. For Elizabeth, not yet 6 years old, the loss of her father was a wound that never fully healed. Friends and relatives would later say that she rarely spoke of Cleo, and when she did, it was with sadness. Phoebe shouldered the responsibility of raising her daughters alone, working as a bookkeeper for the Holland Butter Company, and moving the family from Boston into a modest home in nearby Medford, Massachusetts. It was not easy. Money was scarce, but she gave her children stability, even if she could not give them abundance. Phoebe was remembered by those who knew her as resilient, practical, and a little stern. She kept her daughters in line, but she also instilled in them a sense of pride. None of them were allowed to believe they were poor. They were simply in hard times, and they would endure. And even in her stoicism, Phoebe still entertained by playing piano to the girls. Elizabeth adored her mother. Later, when she moved restlessly from city to city, she often wrote letters home to Phoebe, promising she was fine, even when she wasn't. And as for her father, his absence shaped her. A fatherless girl in the 1930s carried a quiet stigma, a sense of never being safe enough. Ghosts have a way of shaping the living. The Short family in Medford was a household of women. Phoebe at the head, 5 daughters at her side. No father at the dinner table, no husband coming home from work. Just a mother scraping together enough income as a bookkeeper to keep food on the table, and a group of girls who learned very young that family could mean survival. Elizabeth was the third of 5. Virginia was the eldest, steady and dependable, the one who took on responsibility early. Dorothea, nicknamed Dottie, followed, quieter, more reserved, but loyal. Then came Elizabeth, already striking even as a child, with her pale skin and dark hair that seemed to set her apart. After Betty came Eleanora, Noni, and Muriel, the 2 youngest. Without a father, the girls developed a closeness and also a competitiveness. In a small house where money was limited, attention was a kind of currency, and Elizabeth, with her dramatic beauty and dreamy temperament, often seemed to command more of it than the others. Yet she was respectful to her mother, never truant or boy-crazy, and displayed kindness to others. When she learned that a neighbor, 5-year-old Mary, had been sexually assaulted, Elizabeth would take the younger girl to the cinema and on walks in the park, trying to give Mary back a sense of normality. For the Short sisters, their father's absence wasn't just a gap in the family portrait, it was a wound. Other children in Medford had fathers who worked in factories, fathers who coached baseball, fathers who came home tired but present. For the Shorts, there was only Phoebe. Elizabeth felt the absence acutely. A fatherless girl in the 30s was often pitied, sometimes judged. For a child like Elizabeth, imaginative, sensitive, always searching for approval, the missing father became both a source of sorrow and a kind of mystery. The family didn't dwell on Cleo's absence, but the silence around the loss of him was heavy. It shaped Elizabeth's understanding of men, unreliable, fragile, mythic in their absence. Elizabeth attended Medford High School, where classmates remembered her as a friendly, popular girl who carried herself with unusual poise. Even in her early teens, she was aware of her appearance. She dressed carefully, styled her dark brown hair, and had a smile that people remembered decades later. One yearbook entry described her as sweet and dreamy. Another friend remembered her as a real movie fan, often talking about film stars of the day. Elizabeth seemed to carry within her a yearning for something bigger, something beyond the sidewalks of Medford. She was also secretive. Even close friends would later recall that she often kept parts of herself hidden. She liked to tell stories, and sometimes those stories blurred the line between truth and embellishment. Part of this was her nature. Part of it was her need for control in a life that felt unpredictable. And part of it, perhaps, was her longing to be more than a poor girl in Medford with a widowed mother and 4 sisters. She wasn't the top of her class academically, but she was liked, admired. Boys noticed her. Girls confided in her. Teachers saw her as well-mannered, though occasionally distracted. She earned B's and C's and the occasional A. But then there was her health. By the time Elizabeth was 15, she was plagued with bronchial problems and underwent surgery for a lung condition. Elizabeth suffered from what most sources describe as severe bronchitis complicated by asthma, likely resulting from repeated respiratory infections in childhood. She continued to suffer from asthma afterward, and doctors worried that the cold New England winters could be dangerous for her fragile lungs. It was during this time that her mother made a choice that would shape the course of her daughter's life. She sent Elizabeth south for the winters, to Florida, where the warm air would be easier on her body. The doctor's advice was blunt. If Elizabeth wanted to survive, she should spend winters somewhere warm and dry. Massachusetts winters were brutal, damp, cold, and dangerous for a girl already scarred by bronchial surgery and prone to asthma. So Phoebe made the arrangements. She had friends in Florida, families who could host Elizabeth through the winters. It wasn't unusual then for fragile children to be sent away for their health. What was unusual was how profoundly these trips would shape Elizabeth's sense of self. Elizabeth was in her mid-teens the first time she made the journey. Imagine the contrast. The soot-stained clapboards of Medford giving way to palm trees and ocean breezes. For a girl who had grown up fatherless, cramped in a small Massachusetts home with 4 sisters, Florida must have felt like another planet. She stayed with family friends, households with enough means to take her in, where she could rest, heal, and attend school part-time when her health allowed. The names of these families have faded into history, but their homes formed the backdrop of her adolescence. Friends from Medford later said Florida gave Elizabeth a kind of glamour she never lost. She came back with stories of sunshine, porches at dusk. Florida was not just medicine for her lungs, it was a prescription for her imagination. And she adopted a new name in Florida, Betty. It was her first glimpse at the power of reinvention. In Medford, Elizabeth had been one of many girls at school. Admired, yes, but part of a small-town crowd. In Florida, Betty was new, exotic. Her Massachusetts accent, her pale complexion, her carefully styled appearance made her stand out. She formed friendships with girls her age, girls who envied her northern sophistication, who noticed how she wore her clothes differently, who teased her for being a little dramatic. Betty wasn't dramatic in temperament so much as presentation. She moved through the world as though someone were always watching. One Florida girlfriend remembered her as always talking about movies, about Hollywood, about stars. Another said she loved to laugh, but always seemed a little sad. Laughter edged with melancholy, beauty edged with fragility. These were the impressions she left behind. Other classmates remembered her as polite, a little shy, but always composed. She had a way of carrying herself that was older than her years, only 15, 16, 17, yet someone rehearsing for a larger stage. For Betty, raised in the cautious rhythms of Depression-era New England, Florida felt modern, even glamorous. She learned how to walk into a room and be noticed, how to accept a compliment, how to smile in a way that hinted at mystery. Phoebe kept every letter her daughter sent. In them, Betty described her life in Florida with a mixture of excitement and reassurance. She was fine, she wrote. The warmth helped her breathe. Between the lines, you can hear the longing. Her letters overflowed with details about clothes, friends, movies, tiny stories that made distance easier to bear. Even then, she was crafting her own mythology, something brighter than the truth, something her mother could believe in. Florida did more than ease her lungs. It gave her an idea that escape was possible, that you didn't have to stay in the place where you were born, that you could reinvent yourself by moving south or west or wherever the weather or fate took you. Betty also got her first job in Florida, working at Mom's restaurant in Miami. Outwardly, she was poised, stylish, flirtatious. Inwardly, she was sick, insecure, dependent. Illness made her vulnerable. Invention made her resilient. Her very name, Elizabeth, lent itself to interpretation. To some, she was Elizabeth. To others, she was Betty. In later years, some knew her as Beth. Each persona meant a different life, a new story. This was the lesson that would define her. Once Elizabeth learned it, she never stopped following it. She would leave Medford again and again, chasing boyfriends, stability, glamour, a wanderer, never rooted, always searching. While her sisters remained in Medford, Betty boarded trains and buses to Florida again and again. For her, these trips weren't just about health, they were about escape. A chance to see a world beyond Massachusetts, to experience palm trees and sunshine and the strange thrill of freedom. But as winter gave way to spring each year, she returned north. With each journey, the longing for escape only deepened. Florida had shown her freedom. Medford reminded her of confinement. Before the end of her sophomore year, Betty dropped out of high school. And despite the glamour she began to sense around her, and perhaps a touch of power she felt in her own ability to enchant, she was still frail. Her lungs never fully healed. She could breathe easier in Florida, but asthma clung to her. Bronchitis returned in fits back in New England. For a teenager, that kind of fragility becomes a hidden identity. Betty was both dreamer and survivor, shaped by loss, by a mother who was practical by definition, by the absence of the man who was supposed to guide her. She understood instability. She knew how to live with longing. And she knew, even then, that beauty could be her armor. Back in Massachusetts in 1942, at the age of 17, she found work in another restaurant. At home, she was still Elizabeth, the dutiful daughter recovering from illness. But in town, with girlfriends, she kept the Betty moniker, light-hearted, a social butterfly, watching other girls fall into their first love stories and wondering when hers would begin. For nearly 13 years, Elizabeth Short lived with the absence of her father as a fact of life. In 1930, Cleo's car had been discovered abandoned near the Charlestown Bridge, and the assumption was that he had leapt to his death. Phoebe became the head of the household. The 5 Short girls were then raised as fatherless children. For Elizabeth, still a child when he vanished, her father's absence was more than financial. It was emotional. It was identity shaping. He was not just dead, he was gone by his own choice. And then, just as she reached adulthood, the impossible happened. In late 1942, a letter arrived. Cleo Short was alive. He had not jumped from the bridge a dozen years before. He had not died. He had simply walked away. By the time the letter arrived, Elizabeth was 18. She had already endured surgery, years of asthma, winters away in Florida, and the strange loneliness of adolescence in a house filled with sisters. And now, with her adult life just beginning, the man she had mourned revealed himself to be very much alive. Cleo was living in Vallejo, California, working at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. He admitted in his plain Yankee way that he had abandoned them, and he wanted contact again. He suggested they journey west to join him. For Phoebe, the revelation was a bitter shock. She had worked, sacrificed, and suffered humiliation, raising 5 daughters alone on a meager bookkeeper's salary. She wanted nothing to do with her late husband. Elizabeth's sisters were cautious. Virginia, Dottie, Noni, and Muriel held bitterness toward their father, and rightly so. They declined Cleo's offer. But Betty was the dreamer, the restless one. She wanted more than Medford, more than bookkeeping, more than small-town gossip. At 18, Betty had something her mother did not, a hunger for escape. Florida had shown her that reinvention was possible. She had already tasted the thrill of being somewhere new, of being noticed. So when Cleo sent her money, $200, and invited her to California, she accepted. For Betty, the calculus was not simple forgiveness, it was opportunity. California was the dream, the West Coast, sunshine, freedom. And if the path there happened to be her father's outstretched hand, then she would take it. We cannot overstate what this moment meant for Betty. Imagine the father you believed dead suddenly writing to you, asking you to come live with him. The grief you carried as a child is transformed into a chance at reunion and resolution. For Betty, whose later relationships with men would later be marked by longing and disappointment, this moment was the blueprint. She learned that men could vanish and then return, that love could betray and then offer hope, that forgiveness could be the price of belonging. When she boarded the train west, she was not just traveling to California. She was stepping into a lifelong pattern, seeking in men the stability her father had robbed from her. It is tempting, in retrospect, to think of this as the moment Elizabeth Short's fate was sealed, to imagine that by accepting her father's invitation, she was already on the path to becoming the Black Dahlia. But that would be too neat, too simple. At 18, she was not a legend. She was simply a girl taking a chance at a new life. California meant movies. It meant glamour. It meant possibility. It was where soldiers returned on leave, where stars were born, where a poor girl from Medford might make herself into someone new. And in the winter of 1942, with a war raging overseas, with her sisters growing older and settling into ordinary lives, Betty saw no reason to stay behind. This is where we leave Elizabeth Short at the end of her childhood, fragile but beautiful, restless but hopeful, stepping onto a train with one small suitcase and a heart full of dreams. She does not know yet what awaits her. She does not yet know that her father's return will not bring the safety she longs for. She does not yet know that her name will one day be erased, and the words "the Black Dahlia" instead scrawled into every future true crime circle. In our next episode, Golden Promise, we'll follow Elizabeth on that train ride west to Vallejo, then to Santa Barbara, to the arrest that hinted at her restlessness, and the early encounters that shaped her into a young woman living on the edge of dreams and danger. But before we leave her here at the train depot, it's worth remembering every legend begins with an ordinary life. Every myth is built from someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. Elizabeth Short's story is not just about the brutal way it ended. It is about the fragile, restless, beautiful way it began. Thank you for listening to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia. Every time we speak her real name, we return a fragment of humanity to a woman the world remembers only for the way she was murdered. This is H. Allegra Lansing. Until next time, may we remember Elizabeth Short not for how she was found, but for how she lived and how deeply she longed to be seen. This series is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and narration by yours truly. Theme music is Black Screen by Ketsa. Link in show notes.